welcome to this week's episode of ClueCon Weekly. Joining us this week is Carlus Henry, Principal Consultant at SafeTech, long time experience in development, architecture, DevOps process, and a lot of roles over his career. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be here.
So before we delve into the topic of today, which is going to involve continuous deployment practices, would you like to give us a quick introduction about yourself?
Sure, no problem. My name is Carlus Henry, just like you said. I am from Grand Rapids, Michigan. I have 25 years of professional husband experience. So my wife and I have
Mm-hmm.
been married for 25 years. We have 7 children, and that's right, I did say 7. My oldest is 23, and that goes all the way down to my 2-year-old, who is an absolute joy. I also should add that my oldest did get married, and they have a little girl. Her name is Winter. So I'm also a grandfather as well, which has
Mm-hmm.
been fantastic. Um, as you mentioned before, as well as 25 years of husband experience, I also have 25 years of professional software experience. I started my career at a small food distribution company in Grand Rapids, which I think a lot of people would probably know. And most of my career has been spent as a contractor consultant, and that is where a lot of my growth professionally really came into view. I've been a tech lead. I also was a software development manager for a while, and I've played the role of DevOps side. So I've seen different perspectives across the software development lifecycle, and I just absolutely enjoy technology, and I love talking about technology. So once again, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for joining us. Well, yeah, I think the experience as a husband and a father of 7 probably helps with the general understanding of how to set up processes, right? Because if you're not organized, that's
Right,
not going to work. It's
right.
I think for the topic for today is continuous deployment and best practices and everything that's around it. Maybe we could start by giving a quick introduction of what is continuous deployment is and how it relates to continuous integration, because you always hear people saying
Mm,
CI/CD, and I'm not even
yes,
sure everybody knows what that is to begin with.
yes. That's an excellent place to begin. So, and also, I just want to add another thing that they mix in with continuous integration and continuous deployment is also continuous delivery. So, if it's okay, I'm going to kind of shed, the differences, at least the way that I understand them and why I define them, and the way that we'll be talking about them during this conversation. So, continuous integration is the concept that if you are a software engineer on a team and you are working on a code line, I'm going to assume that it's probably fair to say everyone today is typically using Git as their version control system. Continuous integration is the idea that you are constantly merging code back into the main branch, but then also you're running tests and you're constantly getting that feedback, as opposed to, when I started my career using CVS and other tools like that,
Mhm.
we would have these long-lived branches with all of our work on it, and we're not integrating everyone's work together into the same place. So it was pretty much a mystery if the code was going to work when everyone had a chance to pull all their code together. So the continuous integration movement said, you know what, that's not really a good practice. Instead, what we should do is we should be constantly integrating our code together, making sure that what is on the main line is going to work. So then that's continuous
Yeah.
integration. Continuous
Mhm.
delivery, which is something that is not the same as continuous deployment, but it's close.
Mhm.
And if you're in an organization and you're working towards continuous delivery, that's excellent. That's a great goal to have. The idea behind continuous delivery is that the main branch is always deployable. So
Mhm.
years ago, I read, I don't know if it was in Extreme Programming Explained or the Pragmatic Programmer, but this idea that at any point in time, the product team should be able to take the latest build and be confident that they could push that code to production. So
Mhm.
continuous delivery is all those practices that you have to use as a software engineer, as a product owner, as an architect, to be able to ensure that the tip of the main branch, once again, I'm using Git language, so hopefully everyone understands, but
Yeah.
the tip of the main branch is ready to be deployed. So now contrast that with continuous deployment. Continuous deployment is the idea of there is no stopping point where the product owner or cloud ops team or the operations team are making a decision of when to go to production. Instead, as soon as you merge the code to the main branch, without any human interaction whatsoever, you are guaranteed to have that code deployed to the various environments as well as production in an automated fashion. So that's the way that I would distinguish between those three.
Well, yeah, I mean that's a great way to state it. I think, in my opinion, and just a sideline, I think
Sure.
Git really enables. It's the whole movement started around Git. We had some kind of used to call it automated builds. Way back in the day, you will have something that will make builds from your CSVs and whatever your source code, or even not from any repo, just literally just automated build. Whenever a file will be changed in a folder, you'd make new packages for Linux distributions or whatever. But Git is really what enabled this new way of working. It's
Yes.
really crucial because of the
Yeah.
short-lived branches, etc. And I feel like, though, I am 10 seconds of reverse introduction. I worked. I worked mainly on testing infrastructure for a long time as a consultant. Was my main focus. So I've written extensions to Cucumber. I've set up all sort of CI/CD systems, and I've done a lot of that. And I feel like the starting point here will be, why are companies so resistant to something that is so beneficial? Like, is it so hard to get people to get into correctly using continuous deployment of delivery, or however we call it? Like, feels like companies actually don't want it. They will tell, no, I want to know when it's happening. And
Yeah. So I can talk a little bit about that. Number one, I've had interesting conversations and interesting experiences because I've actually was working for an organization where leadership actually wanted continuous deployment, and it was the engineers that were pushing back, saying they didn't want it. But in both scenarios, I think what I found is a common thread, which is when organizations are faced with the decision of whether or not they're going to move to continuous deployment, there's a lot of fear and insecurity around it. And I believe that's because they think that they can use the same practices, the same software development practices, the same architectural practices that they're using today inside of a continuous deployment culture. And that is something that I believe would not work. You have to change the way that you approach software development. You have to change the way that you approach testing. And I'm glad you did share with me that you have a testing background, because that is definitely something that does impact, or it does change in the continuous deployment culture. The same practices that they're doing in a non-continuous deployment culture will not work. Will not work, period. I would say, as strong as it will not work, period. There may be some exceptions out there, but I can't really believe that'll be true.
So what do you think would be the first changes to make to an organization to enable a culture of continuous deployment?
Right,
Like,
right.
what
So
do developers need to understand?
yes. So I'm trying to break off different pieces, because of course the question you're asking is giving me all kind of ideas and directions to go. So number one, you have to approach every software feature in such a way to, how can I introduce changes without breaking production? So for example, in a non-continuous deployment environment, this is just a simple example, you would probably have no problem with changing the name of a column on a database. Now, as software engineers know, if you change a column name on a database, especially if it's used throughout the source code or maybe different source code, you have to actually go inside each one of those code bases and change the query to pull back the information. So when it comes to a non-continuous deployment environment, you would have to time these changes to work at the same time. In other words, you can't make the database change to change a column name and not deploy the source code, because the source code is referencing the old column name. So these are the kind of practices, just an example of a practice that would not work in a continuous deployment environment. Instead, what you have to do is you have to think as an engineer, as an architect, how can I move the code forward? How can I make progress on the system that I'm working on without negatively impacting production? And of course, changing a column name would never work. Same thing as changing an API response to have the field name in the API response. That would break many people, especially if you have multiple consumers. So you have to approach these problems that we face every day when it comes to software development, when it comes to refactoring and things of that nature, in a way to where it does not break production.
Do you think that Docker and in general containerization of systems helps in regards to achieving a better usage of continuous practices?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let me think. Probably maybe 10 years ago, or I can't remember how long ago, when we started moving applications to the cloud, one of the things that was really popular was the 12-factor application.
Oh
Do you
yeah.
remember something like that? Okay. So the 12-factor application, I'm not going to enumerate all of them, and I probably wouldn't remember any of them except for this one, which is the configuration should exist outside of the application. Or at the very least, it should be version controlled and it exists outside of the application. So what you should be able to do is take your software and move it to any environment, and based where it's placed, it will be able to respond accordingly. So one of the things we'll probably end up talking about is the concept of feature flags. Feature flag is kind of a loaded, it's a loaded term because, sometimes it's not just a feature flag. So maybe I'll refer to them more as guards. But let's say, for example, you're working on some new functionality. That new functionality could break production. So a way to not do that, especially when it comes to containerization, is that you would have a feature flag to say it's a simple Boolean, a yes or no. And in the lower environments, it will be set to true, whereas in production, it will be set to false. So why would you do that? You would do that because it gives you the ability to deploy the code continuously over and over again without affecting production users. So you can still see the progress of the features that you're making inside the lower environments, and you can still push to production. And this is a pivotal change when it comes to software development within the continuous deployment culture, because up until now, software engineers can make any changes on the code line they want without, and then through a coordinated deployment to production, that is what adds the new functionality to production, or I should say, that is what enables the exercise of the new code inside the production area. They do all their testing in the lower environments, and then they all get together at some appointed time in the future and then schedule the deployment and then watch and see what happens. Well, in the continuous deployment environment, and as you mentioned in the containerization, you have these feature flags, gives you the ability to always be able to deploy, just all the time, anytime, whenever you want to, because you know that your changes will not affect production. And only after you actually turn the flag on is when, in production, your users will benefit from the new functionality.
Yeah, that's we use that internally, and I think that's a very good starting point. That feature flags are the number one thing. Yeah, 12-factor actually originated with Heroku, and in turn, that means it's essentially originated with Ruby on Rails, which is the framework I built my career on. And I was at one point I did enjoy working with founders of the Ruby language and a few other things. So it was really, really interesting. Yeah, I remember that. And I think feature flags are the number one not used correctly feature out there right now. People just don't use them properly. It's a lot of so yeah, I think those are very good general starting points. But especially with large organizations, I see a lot of breakage between different teams. So if you have one team, it's 5 people, and you have a clear lead usually, and 4 people were working on the various aspects of a project. That's one thing. When you grow up to having 80 or 90 engineers that are divided up into different branches, and they tend to be split up by function and not by feature, meaning that you have all the network engineers, all the application engineers, all the database engineers. They talk to each other, and then everybody ships one different part that goes into sort of a cauldron. So what are the challenges with scaling CI and CD and in general those practices?
Sure. So, unfortunately, I haven't had that same experience. And I do believe it does exist out there where you have teams focused on the tier, like teams gathered around the front end, teams gathered around the application logic level, the APIs, if you will, and teams gathered around the database. It is definitely a harder starting point as opposed to if you had cross-functional teams that could do both the front end, the application layer, and the database changes. So what I will comment on is I have had experience where the operational team was completely responsible for the database changes. So software engineering teams, maybe I should clarify roles. A lot of times I'll say software engineers, then I'll say quality engineers, and then let's just say DevOps engineers or the operational team. And of course, software engineers write the software, quality engineers or do the quality checks and things of that nature, and the operational team is responsible for infrastructure, but also sometimes database changes. That's hard. I mean, there's no doubt about it. That is very difficult. And I would probably challenge gently. So if I had a customer who really believed and organized their teams in that way, well, let's say that I didn't. Once again, moving to this mind shift where code is going to be continuously deployed, you have to have everybody on board if your team are structured around each tier. Everybody on board has to say, okay, what is the way that we can introduce these changes without breaking production? So going back to the earlier example, if you want to change a column name, you know what? Maybe you can't change the column name. Maybe instead what you do is you add a new column and you put a feature flag around the usage of that new column, and then you deploy that to production. Because from an operational standpoint, adding a new column is a great example of something that does not need a feature flag. There's no problem with adding a new column, right? The same thing is true if you're adding a new API endpoint. There's no reason to add a new feature flag, period. So in situations like that, where there's teams around the tier, it would be difficult because now you've increased the number of communication lines, but you would have to make sure everybody is on board that we make changes to production in a way that does not break production. It sounds kind of silly to say that out loud, but you really have to say that. Now, if you're in the other situation where you actually have cross-functional teams, so inside of one team, they're responsible for all aspects of the application, the front end, the middle tier, and the back end. That's a lot simpler, one, because you're only dealing with one team. You're not doing all these cross-line communications, which of course things get lost, but they all have to be on board in the same way that every time we touch this code, what is a way that we can make sure that we do not impact production? So scalability in a large organization, in a small organization, I would probably recommend the same thing. I would choose a team to pilot it with, because there's growing pains when it comes to moving from non-continuous deployment to continuous deployment. And as opposed to a shock to the system for everybody to change the way of doing things, it would probably be good to have a pilot team go through this process and see how their day-to-day lives are going to change, how their software practices are going to change in order to accommodate this new and, I believe, much better culture when it comes to being responsible for the software that we build.
That's a very good point. Yeah, the starting from one place is certainly going to help. One thing I wanted to ask you about is a lot of best practices discussions, even recently, are always taken in the context of web applications. Web applications are, I don't want to jinx it, one of my applications is going to break the moment I say this, but web applications are easy mainly because they're stateless. So when you got one request, it goes through the system, goes back. If you change the system that moment, the following request we already got the new code. There's starting no state to contend with, nothing to reboot, no services to cycle, whatnot. It's just it's a new code handling the same page. So where it was red, now it's green, done, nothing else. But how about continuous deployment in an area like real-time communications, where I have processes running all the time? There are calls that are ongoing, so I cannot restart a server because a call is being processed, or I cannot restart a server because a message is being processed. Maybe it's an MMS with a big attachment. So when the CD system decides, okay, I'm updating all the application code, there are 3 servers that are processing 5 megabyte PDFs that are being sent as attachments. So those are to wait, etc. How does this make it more complicated? And are there any suggestions or best practices you have there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So going back to the earlier statement of where containerization definitely does help, as you know, in the containerization environment, you're using Kubernetes or another framework, those pods are shutting down, they're starting up at any minute. So a lot of times in that infrastructure, or if you're targeting that infrastructure, you would have to take those things into account just by the nature of the architecture of the application and what it sits upon. I would also say that those problems have to still exist, even if you're not doing continuous deployment. So at some point, someone is going to want to make a
Right.
change to the code, and it might be processing, a couple gigabyte data file, whatever have you, and there has to be some mechanisms in place to whereas you can either pause, well, that would be great. Pause and resume would be absolutely wonderful, or you just stop and restart that process when the new code is delivered. So I don't think that it would necessarily be specifically a continuous deployment challenge, only because those same challenges exist today. However, what it does present is maybe you are working on a piece of software who does not have the pause and resume functionality because you only deploy your code once a month. Well, once you start deploying your code more rapidly, and this goes back to the earlier statement, you can't use the same processes that you're doing today in a non-continuous deployment environment that you would use in a continuous deployment environment. Because if you're anything like me, I love to merge code to the main branch, and I do it frequently, and I do it multiple times a day. And every single time I do that, it's going to go to production, meaning it's going to stop some job if I don't have the capability to pause and resume. It's going to stop some job and then start all over again, which may take an hour process, and that's just not going to work. So then what you start seeing is, okay, we have to make accommodations, which I think are for the better, in order to support this continuous deployment culture. So now you have to figure out, okay, maybe there's a better way we could process this 5 gigabyte file or 100 gigabyte file. I don't know why I say 5 gigabytes, pretty small. Anyway, maybe there's a better way to process that in such a way that'll support continuous deployment. But then overall, it makes your whole software portfolio better, because a process that maybe took, I don't know, a couple hours to process a couple 100 gig or a terabyte file, maybe you want to approach that differently and maybe split the file up and feed it out and be able to process it more faster because of the pressure that continuous deployment is starting to put on things. So I really do believe that continuous deployment is just a game changer overall, and it just pushes us to be better software engineers, architects, quality engineers, and operational staff across the board.
Yeah, there's you're right that most of the problems actually are not as excessive to actual to just continuous deployment. You have to restart the process at some point. That is absolutely and certainly true. It is it's so one last thing, one objection I see to this kind of process and a lot, and I'm speaking for experience because internally we have our own brand of CI/CD, but some teams will say, I don't like this, I want to do that. Some other teams are, everybody has their own experience and recommendation on how to build it. We do virtual balance, but what are some best practices about safety and being confident the process works, aside from starting small with a team? Say I already have a CI/CD system, but I don't fully trust it.
That's great. That's perfect. Okay, So let me take a couple steps back. So put yourself in the mindset of a software engineer or quality engineer who is now working in an environment that's not continuous deployment. I actually listened to one of the ClueCon Weeklies where I think you were being interviewed, and you mentioned how the best software engineers are lazy, and I agree. I do agree with that 100%, because we should be automating everything that we do. Period. There might be a little bit of, and please, my software engineer brothers and sisters, don't take this the wrong way, but there are times, especially when I was working in a non-continuous deployment environment, where myself would cut corners. What do I mean when I say cut corners? Well, do I really need to write a unit test for this? I mean, come on. It's just a small change. And by the way, I'm sure some quality engineer will catch an error if there is in one of the higher environments. You know, it's not like I'm going to commit this code and it goes immediately to production, because if it was going to go immediately to production, I probably would write that unit test to make sure it works. Or I probably would do a little bit more manual testing on my machine to make sure that the process is working, right? So once again, just that continuous deployment mindset is leveling up your personal software practices and your personal responsibility. So when it comes, and then also I should also combine in there the idea that we mentioned before, which is the feature flags. When it comes to feature flags, and forgive me, I'm gonna dive in just real quick, just a little bit. You know, one of the first changes that you should do is you introduce the feature flag, and all you do is write a log statement saying the feature flag is on or the feature flag is off. It's just saying the state of the feature flag.
That's a good point. Yeah.
That's the only change you do, and then you push that to production all the way through. So now you can monitor and say, okay, in the lower environments, the feature flags, they're working because I can see that they're on. In the higher environments of production, I can see it's working because it says it's off. That is the security blanket that you get to wrap yourself up in and snuggle with, because you know that any code change that you make behind that feature flag is not going to see production execution. It's only going to see the lower environment execution. Therefore, you could test, everyone can test to their heart's content in the lower environments, and there's no blocking production deployment, meaning it can just continually get deployed, continue to get deployed. So once you are 100% satisfied through your lower environment testing, and remember, this code has always been going to production, once you're satisfied with that, there really is no risk to introducing it to production, because the only change you really need to make is taking that flag that is a false and turning it true, and that's it. So I would say there's less risk associated with continuous deployment, which is probably weird to say, but I do believe there's less risk associated with continuous deployment than not. Because on the other side, when you consider what a lot of companies are doing today, is that they're just making changes, right? And then at some point in the future, 2 weeks, hopefully, maybe a month from now, you'll push the code to production. Well, there was a point in time in my career where I worked for an organization that only pushed code out quarterly. And
wow, that's a long time.
I'm old, that's why. So then they decided to move from quarterly to monthly, and everyone realized that that is a lot less risky. And the main reason why that is, they didn't change any of their development practices. They just moved from quarterly to monthly. And all they did was reduce the amount of change they were introducing into production at a time. So if that's true, if you go from quarterly to monthly, and then now you go from monthly to sprintly, that's all we're doing. We're just trying to reduce the amount of change we're pushing to prod at one time.
Yeah.
Well, then the same thing is true if you're continuous deploying all the time, every day, every hour. You're only pushing out a small amount of change. Plus, with the feature flag on top, it's a lot less risky than a lot of organizations are doing today.
And I do agree that a lot of that can get really dangerous if you leave code changes not fraud. I mean, waiting for too long, it is certainly going to bite back. It's almost a universal rule, right? It's just going to give you problems. So yeah, I definitely agree that it's a needed step to always push often, make sure changes are manageable. I always like to say that teams should strive to get changes deployed that they can fit in their mind at one time. Like if I don't remember what I'm deploying, it's too much. If I know what I'm deploying, it means it's enough, and I can. That's a good rule of thumb. It doesn't always work out, but it's it is definitely a good way to put it.
Definitely.
Cool. Well, I mean, thank you so much. There was a lot of interesting discussion, and I think people should just reach out to to you and see if you can. If you need help, Carlos, I think is available as a consultant. Reach out to him and ask him questions and go from there. And other than that, yeah, my recommendation is really look into this as a more senior engineer slash almost manager at this point. I think it's not something you can do without in any organization, whether it's because otherwise the pressure to get deployments out one way or another is really too high. That's my feeling. That's how you get problems.
Exactly. And I'm just thinking in my head, I'm sorry because I know you're trying to close, but even what is this world of generative AI going to bring us? Because they're expecting us to pump out more code faster. Well, if we're still doing this slow cadence of deploying to production, there's a mismatch there. So I agree with you. We have to move to this continuous deployment methodology.
That's a great point. AI is making people push out more code because it's easier. Again, always assuming you're a good developer. You know what you're doing, and you're not you're doing things the right way, etc. It is certainly a feeling that I share. There's more code being produced, and the more code being made means there's more to manage. That is 100% true.
Definitely.
Cool. Well, again, Carlos, thank you very much for joining us today, and it was a great chat. And maybe we can delve into maybe we could do a part 2 where we delve into more specific systems, like what are your favorite open source parts of CI/CD, non-open source stuff you recommend, etc. Maybe that will be good. What do you think about it? Why do we do a part 2 where we go into a practical side?
I would love that, Luca. And thank you again for having me. This is wonderful. I love talking about this stuff, and I really feel honored to be here.
Joined us today, Carlus Henry, Principal Consultant at SafeTech. Thank you for all your insights, and see you next time.
Sounds great. Thank you, Luca. Thanks for having me.
Rest of the people, I'll see you next week. Goodbye.
Bye.